It was a typical evening in our home, the kind I had grown used to over the years. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the passage of time that felt both unrelenting and unbearably slow. I sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting shadows across the room. My husband was in the living room, engrossed in his computer, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. It had become a familiar sight. Him absorbed in his work and me sitting in silence pretending to read or busy myself with something meaningless. Everything was comfortable. Too comfortable. There was no chaos, no emotional upheaval. But that was exactly the problem. The silence between us had become a heavy weight. The intimacy we once shared had faded, leaving a gap that neither of us seemed capable of bridging. I couldn't remember the last time he had truly looked at me, the way he used to when we first met, the way his gaze had once burned with desire. I had everything I needed and yet nothing felt real anymore. I wasn't unhappy, at least not in the way I imagined someone would be in a bad marriage. There was no yelling, no fights, just a sense of stagnation that gnawed at me. I craved something more, something that would wake me up from the monotony. I wanted to feel alive again, to experience something that would stir me from this fog. That's when he walked in, my stepson. He hadn't planned on being there, but he showed up after a long day, needing a place to stay for the night. I hadn't seen him in weeks, but there he was, standing in the doorway, looking a little more grown up than I remembered. "Can I crash here for a while?" His voice was light, but I couldn't ignore the underlying tension in his tone. He didn't want to be a burden, but something about his presence felt like an unspoken invitation. A doorway to a world I wasn't sure I was ready to enter. I nodded, not thinking much of it at first. He was family after all. But as he walked past me, I couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the air, the way the room seemed to shift. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Was it just me, or had he become different? There was something in his gaze that I couldn't quite place, something sharp, something that made me aware of his presence in a way I hadn't been before. I tried to focus on something else, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes lingered on me, as if searching for something I wasn't sure I was willing to give. He sat down at the table across from me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was different this time. It wasn't the comfortable silence of years together. It was loaded, thick with unspoken words, with the tension of what could be. "How's everything?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but there was a certain gravity in it, a depth I hadn't heard before. I hesitated, then shrugged. "It's fine, you know. Just the usual." I didn't want to go into details. There was no point in pretending that everything was perfect. But I couldn't bring myself to explain what was really bothering me. I didn't want to seem ungrateful for the life I had. I just wanted more. He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read me. There was something about the way he looked at me, not the way a stepson looks at his stepmother, but with something more. Something familiar yet foreign. Something that made my heart race a little faster. "You look different," he said, his voice almost too quiet. It wasn't a compliment, nor was it an insult. It was an observation, one that made me feel both seen and vulnerable at the same time. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just laughed, though it came out more as a nervous exhale than anything genuine. "Different, huh? I guess I'm just tired." I waved my hand dismissively, but inside I was anything but tired. I was awake, hyper-aware of every moment that passed between us. The air felt charged, like something was hanging in the balance, waiting to tip over into something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The evening dragged on, but I couldn't escape the pull of his gaze. He seemed to sense it too, the way he lingered just a little longer than necessary, the way he smiled, not just out of politeness but something else, something I couldn't quite identify. His presence in the room was like a crack in the calm surface of my life, and I felt it deep in my chest. This wasn't just a casual visit. This wasn't just a normal evening. There was a shift, a change, and I didn't know how to stop it. When he finally left the room to get ready for bed, I sat there, frozen in the silence that had once felt comforting but now felt like a trap. The weight of it settled heavily on my shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I had been waiting for something to disrupt this routine. Something to make me feel alive again. I glanced at the clock. It was late and I knew I should go to bed. But the thought of lying next to my husband, in that same stale silence, suddenly felt unbearable. I stood up, my legs shaky as I walked toward the bedroom. And just before I opened the door I heard it. A knock, soft but insistent. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't my husband. It was him, my stepson, standing just outside with something unsaid hanging in the air between us. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And I knew in that moment that whatever was coming next would change everything. The knock on the door lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. My hand, still resting on the doorknob, trembled ever so slightly as I slowly turned it. The quiet of the house had become almost suffocating, each sound amplified in the silence between us. When I opened the door, I didn't know what to expect, but the last thing I anticipated was the vulnerability in his eyes. So raw, so unguarded. There he stood, taller than I remembered, with a subtle tension in his posture. He wasn't a boy anymore, and I had begun to notice it the moment he had stepped into the house. There was something different about him, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just his physical growth, though that was evident. It was the way he carried himself now, self-assured, poised in a way that made my heart flutter against my ribcage. I stepped back instinctively, allowing him space to enter. His presence filled the room immediately, making everything seem smaller, more intimate. The space between us had shifted, though I hadn't yet acknowledged it to myself. I told myself I was imagining things, that nothing had changed. But it had. The air felt different, thick with tension, unspoken desires, and the unsettling awareness that something was about to unfold. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. He entered the room silently, his footsteps almost too quiet, as if he didn't want to disturb the fragile quiet that hung between us. He didn't sit immediately, just stood there for a moment, watching me. His gaze was intense, and for a fleeting moment I wondered if he could see straight through me, if he could sense the turmoil I was trying to hide. He looked so much like his father, yet somehow not at all. There was something about him that set him apart, something I couldn't quite place, but which felt far too intimate for the relationship we had shared. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and careful, but with a trace of concern that made my heart skip. He didn't sound like a stepson worried about his stepmother. His tone was more like a man wondering if I needed something he could offer, something more than just the usual pleasantries. I nodded, though the answer wasn't exactly true. "I'm fine," I said almost mechanically. But my eyes couldn't meet his, not for more than a brief second. I had to look away, afraid he might see the truth in them, afraid I might not be able to lie convincingly enough. He seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to continue. His hands, once at his sides, now fidgeted with the sleeve of his shirt, and I caught myself watching the subtle movement of his fingers. I quickly tore my gaze away, scolding myself inwardly for allowing it to linger on such insignificant details. But the moment had passed, and the silence between us stretched long again, both of us caught in the same unspoken tension. "I've noticed, you've seemed different lately," he said, his voice lower now, almost like a confession, as though he was giving me space to react, to respond. There was something about the way he said it. Not accusing, not prying, just stating a fact, one that had been growing between us for days, weeks, perhaps longer. I didn't respond immediately, unsure of how to navigate this conversation. His words cut through the thick layer of indifference I had carefully built up around myself. It wasn't that I didn't want to answer. It was that I wasn't ready to face the truth, even if it was already standing right in front of me. "I've just been tired," I muttered, the lie falling easily from my lips. But the words tasted bitter. Tired was far too simple an explanation for what had been happening inside me. What had been stirring in my chest for weeks, for months now. A desire, a craving for something I couldn't fully comprehend. He nodded slowly, but his gaze never left me. It was as if he were waiting for me to reveal more, as if he could sense the walls I had erected around myself. And for a moment I wanted to tear them down to let him in. But the fear of what would happen if I did held me back. "You're not tired," he said almost to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. "You're something else." His eyes searched my face as if looking for a sign, a hint, that I might admit what he already suspected. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and I found myself struggling to breathe under the weight of his gaze. What was it about him, about this moment, that made everything feel so different? Why did it feel like something was slipping away from me, something I had no control over? His words hovered in the air between us, heavy and pregnant with meaning. I had no idea where this conversation was headed, nor could I see a way out of it. It was as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink, and there was no way back. The only direction left was forward. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice soft, a slight hesitation in his tone. But there was an unmistakable sincerity behind the words. I just wanted to check on you. I could feel my pulse quicken, my heart thumping in my chest. I wasn't uncomfortable, not in the way he thought. It was something else entirely, something much deeper that stirred inside me every time he was near. I was afraid that if I let this go on, there would be no turning back. But I didn't tell him any of that. Instead, I offered him a small smile, a hollow attempt at reassurance. I'm fine, I repeated, though the words felt even emptier now than they had before. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he would say something more, ask more questions. But instead he simply nodded, his eyes lingering on me for just a second longer before he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone with my thoughts. I closed the door behind him slowly, my hand lingering on the knob, my heart still racing. The quiet returned, but it was no longer the same. It felt more oppressive, more suffocating. In the silence, I could still hear his words echoing in my mind, the subtle accusation hidden beneath them. You're not tired. You're something else. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the precipice of something irreversible. Something that, no matter how hard I tried to deny it, was already beginning to unfold. The night felt longer than it should have, stretched thin with the weight of what had just happened. His words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't quite make sense of them. I could still see the way his eyes lingered on me, searching as if there were something he knew, something I couldn't hide even if I tried. It was strange, unsettling, and yet I found myself thinking about it long after he had left my room. His presence had altered the rhythm of my life in a way I hadn't expected. I should have gone to sleep, should have let the comfort of routine pull me into a peaceful slumber. But sleep eluded me as it often did these days. The bed beside me felt colder than it had in years. It was a cruel reminder of everything I felt was missing, everything I had been craving for so long. My husband, on the other hand, had barely spoken to me that evening. He was buried in his own world, lost in his work, distracted by his own problems, and it seemed like there was no room left for us. I couldn't tell whether he had noticed the change in me, or if he simply didn't care. Maybe he was too busy to even notice. The thought made me feel empty, more alone than I had ever felt before. It wasn't that he didn't love me, but it was as if love had become something we both took for granted, something that no longer required effort. I had told myself that I was fine, that everything was just a phase, a passing moment of discontent. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. The truth was far more complicated. My body ached with the kind of desire I hadn't felt in so long, and it wasn't the kind of desire that could be filled with a few stolen kisses or half-hearted attempts at intimacy. I needed more. I craved a kind of connection, a fire that had long since gone out in my marriage. It was a hunger that felt like it was gnawing at me from the inside out. The next morning I woke up before the sun, the weight of the previous night still hanging over me. The house was still and quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I dressed quickly, almost mechanically, as if moving through a routine I no longer wanted to follow. My hands trembled slightly as I put on my clothes, my fingers grazing the fabric of the blouse that clung to my skin. I felt self-conscious in my own skin, acutely aware of the distance between myself and the woman I used to be. The woman who had once been full of confidence, desire, and fire. Now I felt like a ghost, drifting through the motions of a life that no longer fit me. I made my way to the kitchen, and as I poured myself a cup of coffee, I couldn't help but wonder what the day would bring. Would it be like every other day, with my husband absorbed in his work, my mind wandering to places I didn't want to go? Or would something change, something unexpected, something that would shake the foundation of my carefully constructed life? As I sat at the kitchen table sipping my coffee, my thoughts drifted back to my stepson. What had he meant by what he said? What had he seen in me that made him look at me the way he did? I had tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting moment, a passing curiosity. But I knew deep down that it was more than that. His presence had awakened something inside me that I couldn't ignore. Something that had been buried beneath years of complacency, of routine, of never asking for more. I had always told myself that I loved my husband, that I was content with the life we had built together. And in many ways I still did love him. But love was no longer enough. It had become a word, a label we attached to our lives because it was expected of us. But the passion, the fire, the connection that I had once felt, it was gone, and I didn't know how to get it back. I couldn't just keep pretending, living in this empty shell of a relationship. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. The sudden movement startled me, but I couldn't stay still any longer. I needed to get out of the house, to do something, anything that would distract me from the thoughts that were spiraling out of control. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face as I walked down the driveway. The neighborhood was still, the houses bathed in the pale light of early morning. I needed to clear my head, to breathe in the world outside of the confines of my own home. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was looking for. But I walked, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps, trying to outrun the restlessness that seemed to consume me. After a while, I found myself by the park, sitting on one of the benches watching the world go by. The park was quiet, save for the occasional sound of birds overhead, and I couldn't help but wonder how many others felt as I did, trapped in lives they hadn't chosen, wondering if there was more out there, something better, something that would make them feel alive again. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the park wash over me. And then, without warning, I felt a presence beside me. I opened my eyes to find my stepson standing there, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle, his eyes searching mine. The question was the same, but this time it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I realized how close we had become, how much he had begun to mean to me in ways I hadn't fully understood. "I'm not sure," I said finally, my voice shaky but honest. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore." He sat down next to me without saying a word. His presence was comforting yet unsettling all at once. I didn't know where this was heading, but it felt inevitable. Like everything that had led to this moment had been building towards something we couldn't ignore any longer. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. Something that would force me to finally face the truth of what I had been hiding from. The days that followed felt like a blur. I went through the motions of daily life. Getting up, going to work, pretending to be the same person I had always been. But something had shifted inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he looked at me, the way his presence seemed to seep into every corner of my thoughts. It wasn't something I had asked for, nor had I been prepared for it. Yet there it was, growing steadily in the back of my mind. Each time I saw my husband, I felt more distant. His voice, though familiar, now sounded like an echo of something I could no longer connect with. We still shared the same bed, the same house, but the space between us had grown wider, more pronounced. Every touch felt mechanical, every kiss an obligation. He hadn't noticed the change, not fully. Or if he had, he hadn't said anything about it. He was wrapped up in his own life, consumed by work, by the predictable rhythm of his days. He seemed oblivious to the quiet unraveling of our connection, the subtle erosion of what had once been an intense bond. And then there was him, my stepson. The mere thought of him made my pulse quicken, my heart race in a way that terrified me. I had never considered myself someone who would betray the trust of my partner. But the more I tried to push my feelings aside, the more insistent they became. It was as though I couldn't escape him. His presence had become a constant, a reminder of everything I had been denying. I tried to avoid him, tried to stay away. I told myself that nothing had changed, that it was just a passing phase, but the truth was undeniable. Every time he was near, every time our eyes met, there was an intensity in the air that I couldn't ignore. It was a silent agreement between us, an understanding that neither of us dared to name, but both of us could feel. The tension between us grew thicker, more palpable with each passing day. And yet, despite my attempts to keep my distance, I found myself seeking him out, finding excuses to be near him. It wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. But it was real. The pull was magnetic and I couldn't seem to break free from it. Each stolen moment felt like both a blessing and a curse. I knew that what I was doing was dangerous, but there was an undeniable thrill to it, a rush that came with the secrecy, the forbidden nature of what was happening between us. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table, my husband still at work, the house quiet and empty, I heard a soft knock on the door. I knew who it was before I even opened it. My heart skipped a beat as I made my way to the front door, the air thick with anticipation. He was standing there, his face slightly flushed, as though he had been waiting outside for a while. He didn't speak immediately, his gaze fixed on me, searching as if waiting for me to say something, anything, that would acknowledge what had been hanging between us. "I need to talk to you," he said softly, his voice low, almost hesitant. I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of fear and desire knotting in my stomach. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter, though every part of me screamed that this wasn't the right thing to do. But I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to stop it. He sat down across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence between us was charged, each passing second making the weight of our unspoken words feel heavier. My mind raced, my heart thudded in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. It was as if I had forgotten how to form words, how to explain the chaos I felt inside. Finally, he broke the silence. I can't stop thinking about you, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and vulnerable. I froze. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, the moment suspended in time. His words were like a spark that ignited a fire within me, a fire I had tried so hard to suppress. But now there was no escaping it. I don't know what's happening, he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. But I can't ignore this, whatever it is. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The desire was there, just beneath the surface, bubbling up in response to his admission. But I couldn't let it out, not yet. Not without acknowledging the consequences of what we were both doing. I didn't know what to say. I could feel my body reacting to him, to his words, but I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge it. The guilt began to creep in, a familiar feeling that I had been trying to avoid. What was I doing? How had we gotten here? I can't. I stumbled over my words, my mind racing, trying to find a way to make sense of everything. But there was no easy answer. The truth was, I didn't know what to do either. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from him as possible. But another part of me, a part one couldn't deny, wanted to close the distance between us, to feel his touch, to feel something real again. He reached out then, his hand tentative, as if he wasn't sure if I would pull away. But I didn't move. His fingers brushed against mine, sending a shockwave of electricity through my body. It was gentle, soft, yet it felt like everything I had been longing for. The touch, the connection, it was something I couldn't explain. And in that moment I knew that whatever had started between us, whatever this was, couldn't be undone. I don't want to hurt you, he whispered, his voice full of sincerity. I don't know how to stop this. I don't want to stop. I felt my heart pound in my chest, my breath coming faster, more shallow. His words had ignited something inside me, a hunger I hadn't felt in years. The temptation to give in, to embrace what we both were feeling, was almost too much to bear. But the consequences, the damage it could cause, were too great. And yet, in the back of my mind, there was a small voice telling me that maybe, just maybe, I was already too far gone to stop. As he sat there, his hand still lingering near mine, I realized that the silence between us had changed. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or regret. It was the silence of shared understanding, a silence that spoke volumes in its own way. And as I sat there, torn between my fear and my desire, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like walking a fine line between reality and something else, something dangerous that neither of us could name but both of us could feel. His touch still lingered on my skin, an electric sensation that refused to fade no matter how much I tried to bury it. My mind raced in a constant whirl of conflicting emotions, fear warring with desire, guilt mingling with the aching need for something more. Every time I saw him, the space between us seemed to shrink, and yet every time we were apart, I felt the weight of the silence, heavier than it had ever been before. I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't even tell myself what was happening. How could I? How could I explain it? This wasn't some fleeting affair, some momentary lapse in judgment. This was something else entirely, something deeper. It was as though the very foundation of my life was shaking, and I was standing in the middle of it, helpless to stop it from crumbling. But the world didn't stop. It didn't pause to let me catch my breath, to let me untangle the mess inside of me. I went through the motions, pretending to be the woman I used to be. At work I smiled, made small talk, did what was expected of me. But when I came home it felt like everything was different. My husband was still the same, distant, wrapped up in his work, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface of our marriage. But I could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. I wasn't the same. Not anymore. Every night I would lie in bed next to him, the warmth of his body beside mine a sharp contrast to the coldness I felt inside. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shut my mind off. My thoughts would drift to him, to what we had shared. That fleeting electric moment that had somehow opened a door to something I couldn't walk away from. I wasn't sure what it was that had drawn me to him, whether it was the attention, the care, or something else entirely. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was something I had been craving for a long time. The guilt was suffocating, but it didn't stop me from seeking him out. Each time I saw him, it was like I was drawn to him by some invisible force, one that I couldn't resist. I would find excuses to be near him, to feel that spark, that warmth that seemed to emanate from him. Each stolen glance, each brief touch, felt like an affirmation of everything I had been feeling. It was intoxicating. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of what we were doing began to settle over me like a heavy cloak. The secrecy, the lies, the constant fear of getting caught, it all started to eat away at me. And yet, even with all of that, I couldn't bring myself to stop. The truth was that I didn't want to stop. I didn't know how to stop. One evening, as I walked through the hallway, my thoughts consumed by everything and nothing, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat and I turned, almost expecting to see him standing there. But it wasn't him. It was my husband, looking at me with a puzzled expression. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I forced a smile, but it felt like a mask I couldn't keep in place. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, my voice betraying me, too soft, too distant. He didn't press. He never did. He just nodded and turned to go back to his office. But something in the air had changed, a shift that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or maybe it was just my own growing awareness of how much I had distanced myself from him. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew, even if he didn't say anything. There was something in his eyes that made me question everything, made me wonder if he could see through the facade I had carefully built. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping that a cup of tea would calm my nerves, but as I opened the cupboard to fetch the tea leaves, I heard another knock on the door. I froze. I didn't need to wonder who it was. It was him once again, just as inevitable as the rising sun. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of anticipation and fear flooding through me. I stood still for a moment, gathering my thoughts, trying to steady my breath. There was no turning back now, not after everything we had already shared. I walked toward the door, my movements slow, deliberate, as though each step was drawing me closer to a precipice I wasn't sure I was ready to fall from. When I opened the door, he was standing there, his expression unreadable. The moment he saw me, his eyes softened and I felt a twinge of something deep within me. It was the same feeling I had every time I saw him. An electric pull, a magnetism that I couldn't ignore. And for the first time I realized that I didn't want to. "I need to see you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet heavy with meaning. I didn't respond immediately. The words stuck in my throat, tangled with the guilt and the desire that had become so familiar. But I didn't need to say anything. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and I didn't pull away. Without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing gently against my arm. It wasn't a casual touch. It was something else, something more intimate, something that made my breath hitch in my chest. For a moment we stood there, the weight of the world pressing down on us, but neither of us moving, both of us caught in a moment we couldn't undo. His fingers traced the edge of my sleeve, a touch so light, so delicate, that it felt as if time itself had slowed. Every part of me, every inch of my skin seemed to respond to him, to the electricity between us. And in that moment I realized there was no going back. No matter how much I tried to deny it, this was the path I had chosen, the path we had both chosen. The only question now was how far we were willing to go. He stepped closer, his lips just inches from my ear. "I can't stay away from you," he whispered. The words were like a spark in a dark room, igniting a fire that consumed me whole. I stood there, frozen, the soft brush of his lips against my ear still lingering in the air, sending a shiver down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to pull away, to end this madness before it spiraled any further. But something deep inside me, a part one didn't fully understand or want to acknowledge, pulled me closer to him. The tension between us crackled in the stillness of the room, thick with unspoken words, heavy with everything we had already shared. For a long moment we simply stood there, inches apart, caught in the electricity of the situation. His hand, still resting lightly on my arm, sent waves of heat through my body. It wasn't just the physical touch, though that was undeniably potent. It was the connection, the silent understanding that had been growing between us ever since that first glance, that first moment of undeniable attraction. I had been lying to myself for so long, pretending that I could ignore what was happening. I had told myself that it was just a fleeting feeling, something that would pass. But here now, with him standing so close, I knew the truth. This wasn't something I could just walk away from. Not anymore. Whatever had started between us had become more than just a passing infatuation. It was a pull that I couldn't escape. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I had no idea what to say. What could I say? Stop felt too weak, too insignificant to halt the tide of emotions that had already flooded my heart and mind. I was already too far in, caught between guilt and desire, between the life I had built and the chaos I was willingly stepping into. His hand slid from my arm to my waist, his touch gentle yet firm, as if silently asking for permission, waiting for me to make the choice. The choice to either stay in the comfort of my mundane life or to cross the threshold into something entirely new, something dangerous, intoxicating, and ultimately irreversible. My breath caught in my throat, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I thought of my husband, of the life we had built together, of everything I had once believed in. But when I tried to picture him in this moment, in this space between us, it felt distant. It felt like a world I no longer belonged to. The connection I had with him had been slowly unraveling, thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the quiet void that had opened up between us. And then there was him, my stepson. A man in the truest sense of the word, though there was still something about him that felt youthful, full of possibility. His presence in my life had been innocent enough at first, but somewhere along the way it had become something else. It had become a silent understanding, a shared energy that neither of us could deny. "I can't keep pretending," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. I hadn't even meant to say them aloud, but now that they were out there I couldn't take them back. The confession hung in the air, the truth of it settling between us. His fingers tightened on my waist, pulling me just a little closer. I could feel the heat of his body, the warmth that seemed to draw me in despite everything I knew was wrong. He didn't say anything in response. Instead, he simply looked at me, his gaze intense, searching, as though he were waiting for me to make the next move, to show him that this was real, that I wasn't just caught up in the whirlwind of emotions that had been spiraling out of control. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, the frantic beat echoing in my ears. Every part of me screamed for me to stop, to pull away, to regain control. But in the silence that stretched between us, all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, quick and shallow. My body betrayed me, reacting to his closeness, to his touch. I wanted him, wanted the connection we shared, no matter how dangerous it was. And the more I tried to fight it, the stronger the pull became. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I allowed myself to close the distance between us. My hands, shaking slightly, reached for him, tentatively at first, then more confidently as the desire took over. My fingers found the edge of his shirt, and I felt the tautness of his muscles beneath the fabric. He didn't move, didn't say a word. It was as if he were waiting for me to make the decision, to show him that I was ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready. Ready to break free from the life I had known. Ready to give in to the raw, undeniable need that had been growing inside me. I kissed him. It wasn't soft, not gentle like the last time. It was urgent, a desperate release of everything I had been holding inside. My lips found his with a fierceness that surprised both of us, and for a moment I forgot everything else. I forgot the guilt, the consequences, the life I was leaving behind. All that mattered in that moment was the fire between us, the heat of his body, the taste of his lips. His hands were on me now, pulling me closer, his touch demanding and sure. There was no hesitation, no more wondering what this was, what it meant. We were past that. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And as his hands slid down my back, I knew there was no going back. The decision had been made and we were both in it together. As the world around us seemed to fade into the background, I realized that I was no longer the person I had been just a few days ago. The woman who had once lived in the safety of routine, of predictability, had disappeared. In her place stood someone new, someone consumed by desire and fear, someone who was about to step into a world that held no guarantees. But I didn't care. In that moment, all that mattered was the feel of him against me, the intensity of the kiss, the knowledge that what we were doing was irrevocable. And for the first time in a long time I felt alive. The morning after felt surreal, like stepping out of a dream and into a world that was far too real, too unforgiving. I woke to the familiar sounds of the house. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of traffic outside, the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. But everything felt different now, as though the very air around me had shifted, warped by the choices I had made the night before. My mind was foggy, my body heavy with the weight of what had happened. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I tried to think, the more the events of the night blurred together, spinning into a dizzying confusion of desire, guilt, and something else. Something I didn't want to name. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room, but it was the silence that seemed to envelop me most. It was a silence unlike any other I had known before. It wasn't the quiet of peace or solitude, but the quiet of something broken, something irreversible. The knowledge that nothing could go back to the way it had been, no matter how much I might wish otherwise. My heart was pounding in my chest, the thudding sound of it almost deafening in the stillness. I could feel the remnants of the kiss we had shared, the way his touch had burned into my skin, leaving a trace of something undeniable. Every part of me was still acutely aware of him, even though he wasn't there, even though the room was empty. His presence lingered, a shadow in the corners of my mind. I thought of my husband, who was still asleep in the other room. The image of him, unaware, struck me with a pang of guilt that cut deeper than I expected. He had been nothing but kind to me, patient, understanding. But somewhere along the way I had drifted away from him, and now there was no turning back. I had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. The thought of it made my stomach turn, but it also filled me with a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't undo it. I couldn't take back what had already happened. The door creaked open and I heard footsteps approach, soft but deliberate. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The air between us had already thickened, the unspoken understanding of what had transpired settling like a heavy fog. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with a quiet intensity. For a moment we just stood there, neither of us speaking. The tension in the room was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, his eyes seemed to be searching the floor, the walls, as if he were trying to find something to say, something to break the silence. But I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't just lie there, pretending like nothing had happened, pretending that we hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and met his gaze. His eyes were dark, full of a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Desire? Or was it something else, something deeper? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. What could I say? There was nothing that could explain what we had done, nothing that could take away the weight of the decision. Instead, I just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that seemed to acknowledge everything between us without saying a word. He nodded back, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, it felt like we were caught in some unspoken agreement, a pact that neither of us had fully understood, but both of us had willingly stepped into. "I'm not sorry," he said suddenly, his voice low but steady. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they were unexpected but because they were exactly what I had been feeling all along. I wasn't sorry either. Not really. In the back of my mind, I knew it was wrong, knew that everything about this was a mistake. But in my heart, in the deepest part of me, there was something that screamed that this was right, that this was what I had been searching for. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off of him. I didn't move away. I couldn't. The pull between us was too strong, too magnetic. His presence was a constant now, a force that I had no control over. For a moment we just sat there in silence, neither of us saying anything more. The world outside continued to turn, unaware of the storm that had just broken between us. But inside, everything had shifted. The foundation of my life, the life I had once known, had been rocked to its core. And there was no going back. Finally, he broke the silence again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a promise, or a threat. I wasn't sure which. But they echoed in my mind, rattling around with everything I had been trying to avoid, everything I had been lying to myself about. "I know," I said, my voice trembling slightly. It was the only thing I could say. The only thing that made sense. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that this wasn't over. Whatever this was, it wasn't a fleeting mistake. It was a beginning. And that realization more than anything else terrified me. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. This silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, charged with everything we had said without speaking. And as I looked at him sitting there so close, I knew that there was no going back from this, no undoing what had already been set in motion. I had made my choice. And now there was no turning back. The days that followed were an endless storm of conflicting emotions. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet my racing thoughts. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and yet, every part of me kept pushing forward, drawn to him in a way that felt as natural as breathing. There was a strange sense of inevitability to it, as if everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen had been leading up to this moment. I wasn't sure what I was becoming, but I knew I could no longer pretend I was the person I had once been. At home nothing was overtly different. My husband went about his usual routine, caught up in his work as always. He didn't seem to notice the subtle shift in me, or maybe he was just too distracted to see it. But I felt it. I felt it in the way I moved through the house, in the way I interacted with him. Every touch, every word felt distant, almost foreign. There was no passion left in the silence we shared, only a heavy, suffocating weight that I couldn't escape. My thoughts kept drifting back to him. My stepson. The moments we had shared, the way he had looked at me with such intensity, the way his touch had ignited something inside of me that I had long since buried. It wasn't just physical. It was the connection, the shared understanding that had built between us. He knew what I needed and I knew what he craved. It was a dangerous game we were playing, but neither of us seemed to want to stop. Each time I saw him it was like a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. His presence filled the room, commanding my attention, making it impossible to think about anything else. I tried to stay distant, tried to push him away, but it never worked. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine, only seemed to draw me closer. The tension between us was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I kept thinking about my husband, about the life we had built together. The life that now felt hollow, empty. I had loved him once, or at least I thought I had. But love was no longer enough. It hadn't been for a long time. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about something else, something I didn't fully understand. My feelings for him had faded, replaced by something new, something dangerous and exhilarating. And so, I found myself standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. I could feel the weight of my decision pressing down on me, the knowledge that whatever I chose would change everything. But I couldn't seem to find the strength to turn away. The pull was too strong, the desire too intense. I had already given in once and there was no denying it now. There was no turning back. One afternoon I found myself alone in the house, my husband out on one of his many business trips. The silence was oppressive, the house too large for just one person. I wandered through the rooms aimlessly, not really knowing what I was looking for. It wasn't until I reached the living room that I saw him, standing by the window, his back turned to me. He didn't hear me approach, and for a moment I just stood there watching him. He was different now. More confident, more assured. The boy I had once known was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to carry an intensity in every movement. I had seen glimpses of it before, but now it was undeniable. He was no longer just my stepson. He was something more, something that both terrified and thrilled me. I took a step closer, my heart racing, and for a moment, I almost expected him to turn and face me. But he didn't. He just stood there, his back still to me, the tension between us thickening with every passing second. I couldn't bring myself to speak. There were no words left. All the emotions I had been holding inside surged to the surface, and I felt a deep aching need to close the distance between us, to finally give in to the temptation that had been growing between us. Finally he spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You know what this is," he said, his words carrying a weight that made my heart skip. "You know what we've both been feeling." I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was nothing to say. His words had already said everything. He turned to face me, and for a moment we just stood there looking at each other. His gaze was intense, searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. But then, without another word, he closed the distance between us, his hand reaching out to gently brush my hair behind my ear. The touch was tender, but there was something else in it, something that made my breath catch in my throat. The connection was undeniable, and I knew in that moment that there was no way out of this. I had already crossed the line and there was no going back. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer, and I couldn't resist. My body responded to him in a way that I couldn't explain, as if it had always known what to do. We were moving in perfect sync now, our bodies drawn together by an invisible force that neither of us had the power to stop. I closed my eyes, the world around me fading away as his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. But then slowly it deepened, the intensity building with each passing second. My hands found their way to his chest, feeling the hard muscles beneath his shirt, and I couldn't help but pull him closer as if I couldn't get enough of him. The kiss was everything I had been missing, everything I had been craving. It was wild and untamed, full of hunger and longing, and in that moment I forgot everything else. The consequences, the guilt, the life I was leaving behind. All that mattered was the heat between us, the fire that had ignited the moment our eyes met. And as I lost myself in the kiss, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. There was no turning back now. The next few days passed in a blur, a haze of emotions that I couldn't quite process. It was as though I had stepped into a new reality, one where the lines between right and wrong had become blurred, and all I could do was hold on and try to navigate the storm I had created. Every glance, every touch felt amplified, like the world had slowed down around us, and everything I had once known was slipping through my fingers. I couldn't think clearly anymore. My mind was clouded, consumed by thoughts of him, of us. I felt as though I was walking through life in a fog, disconnected from the world around me. My husband, oblivious to the changes in me, went about his routine, still absorbed in his work. The distance between us grew with every passing day, but I couldn't bring myself to confront it. There was something new now, something that made everything else fade into the background. I tried to keep my composure, to continue living my life as if nothing had changed, but it was impossible. Every time I saw my stepson, every time he was near me, I felt that electric pull once again. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The way he looked at me, the way he seemed to understand me in a way no one else did. It was intoxicating, addicting. I found myself craving the moments when he was near, when we could share that unspoken connection, that brief touch, that look that said everything without a single word. I knew I was losing myself, but I couldn't stop. The desire to be close to him, to feel his touch, was overpowering. It had taken root deep inside me, and no matter how hard I tried to bury it, it wouldn't go away. The more I tried to resist, the stronger it became. It was as if I was drowning in it, unable to find my way back to the surface. One evening after dinner, my husband went to bed early, as he often did. I was left alone in the living room, my thoughts swirling, my body restless with the need for something more. The house was silent, too quiet, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I needed to get out, to breathe, to escape the tension that was building inside me. I grabbed my coat and slipped out the door, the cold air hitting me like a shock to the system. The neighborhood was dark, peaceful in a way that only made the storm inside me feel louder. I walked without a destination, my mind racing with everything that had been happening, everything I had been trying to deny. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I walked or how hard I tried to push it out of my mind. And then, as if fate had decided to push me further into this whirlwind, I saw him. He was standing by the park, just a few blocks from the house. His back was turned to me, but I knew it was him before I even saw his face. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I hesitated. What was I doing? Why was I even here? But before I could answer my own questions, he turned and our eyes met. There was no need for words. The tension, the desire, the unspoken understanding between us, it all hung in the air, thick and undeniable. He took a step toward me, his gaze never leaving mine, and I knew without a doubt that we were both trapped in this, unable to break free. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, as though this moment was both the culmination of everything and the beginning of something even more dangerous. I didn't know where this was going or what we were doing, but in that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the pull between us, the connection that neither of us could deny. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, stepping into his embrace, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. I didn't care about the consequences, about the life I was leaving behind. All that mattered was this moment, this connection, this feeling that consumed me. His lips met mine and the world around us faded away. It was a kiss like no other, filled with longing, with desire, with everything we had been holding back. The kiss deepened and I felt myself falling into it, unable to stop, unable to pull away. Every part of me responded to him, to the heat of his body, to the passion in his touch. This wasn't just physical. This was something deeper, something that went beyond anything I had ever known. When we finally pulled away, breathless, we didn't speak. There were no words. We didn't need them. Everything we had been feeling was right there, in the air between us, in the way our bodies were still pressed together, as if we couldn't bear to be apart. "I don't want to hide anymore," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his breath warm against my skin. And for the first time I didn't want to hide either. I didn't want to deny what we had, what was growing between us. Whatever it was real and I couldn't keep pretending that it wasn't. As we stood there in the park, the world around us silent and still, I knew that the path ahead was uncertain, that it was full of dangers and consequences that I had yet to fully understand. But I also knew that I had crossed a line and there was no going back. This was our reality now, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, I couldn't escape the truth. I had chosen this. And now we would both have to live with the consequences.